Hello from Westminster. This isn't the edition of the Sky News Daily we were planning this time. Niall Paterson is still on his holidays. He'll be back in the next... Hello from Westminster. This isn't the edition of the Sky News Daily we were planning this time. Niall Paterson is still on his holidays. He'll be back in the next episode. I'm Sky News political correspondent Rob Powell, and I'm here with our chief political correspondent, Jon Craig. So no prizes for guessing what we'll be talking about, because after a period of relative calm in the past few months, everything suddenly started feeling a bit 2022 again. So there's lots to discuss about Boris Johnson, Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams standing down. We should say we're recording this on Sunday lunchtime. The by-election count at the moment stands at 3. Jon, do you think it will get any higher? Any more resignations expected?
I'm not convinced it will. There was a suggestion from Boris Johnson's supporters over the weekend that there could be half a dozen or so. It's claimed also in the Sunday Telegraph by his friends that there are a couple on resignation watch. But one by one, a lot of his closest allies have been saying, no, I'm not standing down. For example, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Sorry, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg has said in the Mail on Sunday he's not standing down. Nadeem Zahawi says he's not standing down. Priti Patel, Dame Priti Patel now, isn't she?
She is, yes.
My word, there's all these... We'll talk about the honours later, but my word, they've all done very well, haven't they?
It's a lot to get used to, isn't it?
But anyway, they've all said they're not going to stand down. Now, the point I would make about the ones who have stood down, Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams had already said they were not going to be candidates at the next general election. So Nadine's got more time to write her books, her novels, and Nigel Adams got more time to watch cricket. Massive cricket fan, Nigel Adams. He always says to me, and don't forget to mention that I scored 125 not out for the Lords and Commons in a match at Lords. So he's got plenty of time to go to Headingley or whichever cricket ground he chooses.
That's top trivia, Jon. It's interesting, isn't it? The numbers involved, even with the speculation about who's on resignation watch. I think the Sunday Telegraph said there was 2 more people.
Yes.
The numbers are so low. We're really in a different place in terms of where we were in 2022 when we were looking at resignations to try and force Boris Johnson out of government. So what do you think has sort of motivated them to go, Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams? There was some suggestion of a kind of orchestrated plot to try and destabilise the government. Or do you think this is just more people who were going to go anyway, who were a bit frustrated they didn't get their gong, they didn't get their peerage, so they thought, you know what, stuff you, I'm leaving now?
It certainly looked like a coordinated plot. My mind went back to the time when Oliver Dowden quit as Tory chairman after those by-election defeats in, I think it was Wakefield and Tiverton and Honiton. And I remember at the time thinking, oh my goodness, this is going to be a domino effect, lots more followed. And I remember that dramatic night when Rishi Sunak, first Sajid Javid and then Rishi Sunak went. We all thought, oh my goodness, are half the cabinet going to resign? Well, they didn't. But this time, Nadine Dorries' resignation was the first actually. It was on the Friday afternoon. And then Boris Johnson's dramatic announcement. And then Nigel Adams wasn't till Saturday afternoon. And it was at that point that I thought, oh, perhaps there'll be more. But there's a lot of pique over the fact that, of course, they've been cheated the peerages they were hoping to get. Now, I thought at the time we learned that Boris Johnson was proposing to nominate Nadine Dorries, Nigel Adams, Alok Sharma, who's Reading West, the former COP president, and a fourth one, Alistair Jack, the Scotland secretary. I thought it was a balmy idea because you don't give people peerages when they're sitting MPs. You only do it after they've given up. And I think Boris Johnson has badly miscalculated and he's made a complete mess of it.
There is this discussion, isn't there, about whether it's cock-up or conspiracy. There's some around Boris Johnson that seem to be suggesting, despite Number 10 saying, nope, we had no influence, that there was something going on behind the scenes whereby Number 10 did exert some sort of political influence to take some names off the list. But a lot of the reporting in the Sunday papers today suggests that essentially Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson met a week or so ago, and they both came away from that meeting with very different interpretations of what was discussed. Do you think this is something sinister that's been orchestrated by Number 10, or do you think that this is just a bit of a cock-up and Boris Johnson not being across the detail and promising people things that he wasn't in a position to promise?
Well, we all know about Boris Johnson promising people things, and the fact is that Boris Johnson and his allies see a conspiracy in everything. They see a conspiracy in the whole fiasco of the honours, and they see a conspiracy in the Privileges Committee report as well, forgetting that on the latter, Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister when they agreed to set up that inquiry. Gita Hari, his former spin doctor in both City Hall when he was mayor and in Number 10 briefly, 7 months, he said. Gita Hari was saying the big mistake was not challenging the motion to set up this inquiry when it was first proposed. But no, they've been outwitted by the system, if you like. I mean, Jake Berry goes on and on about the blob. But in politics, there are, especially in Parliament, there are a lot of wily people in Parliament, and they know how to play the system and they know how to play the rules. And Rishi Sunak is a details man. He will have looked at the procedure and seen that it's up to the House of Lords Appointments Commission to make the rules here. And I think Boris Johnson's bungled it. And he's made a mess of it. He's let down his allies, who are left with no peerages. And, of course, he's now facing having the book thrown at him by the Privileges Committee.
Yeah, I'm always a bit confused about what's the blob and what's the establishment, or whether there's a cross. I saw one anonymous source quote in the papers today saying this is the blob and the establishment working together. Oh. I always sort of thought that they were one and the same thing, to be honest. So MPs will be back in Westminster for the week. We know that amongst the sort of hardcore of Johnson supporters, a lot of them are very angry and are very sad that he's leaving. But what about the kind of the silent middle bit of the Tory party, if you like? The people that maybe are a bit fed up of the psychodrama, really just want to focus on trying to turn the Tory party's fortunes around ahead of the next general election. Do you think they'll be as exercised about this, as angry about all of this, or just a sort of bit miffed that once again we're talking about Boris Johnson? Where do you think the main majority of opinion lies?
I think that the mainstream group of Tory MPs have probably lost patience with Boris Johnson. The key, I think, will be what the report into Mr Johnson's conduct says. Now, on Friday, when Boris Johnson issued his blistering statement, I think we can call it, his angry rant, the Privileges Committee issued a statement saying we're going to meet on Monday and produce our report promptly, they said. So I think once that report comes out, and one would assume it'll come out within a day or so of the meeting on Monday, I think a lot of Tory MPs will read that and think, oh my goodness, thank goodness he's left Parliament, because he's become an embarrassment. Gita Hari on Sky News launched a pretty strong attack on Harriet Harman, claiming, she used to be the acting leader of the Labour Party. Imagine if it was a Labour MP and William Hague was chairman of the committee. Well, come on. I mean, the fact is there are Tory MPs on that committee, and it has a majority. And the SNP MP, who I think is an ex-Metropolitan Police officer, and I think one of the Tories is a lawyer. This idea that it's all a sort of Labour Party stitch-up, I'm not sure is quite right.
Do you think Boris Johnson carries as much influence in the Tory parliamentary party now than he once did? Or do you think that sort of as Brexit as an issue has started to resolve itself, his kind of power and his magic over his fellow MPs has started to wane again? Like, is this it for Boris Johnson, or is this sort of just the latest reincarnation and he'll eventually be back in some other form?
I think there's no doubt that his influence is not what it was. Do you remember the big vote on the Windsor Agreement? Yeah. There were only, I forget how many rebels, but it wasn't
about 21, 22.
20 or so, wasn't it? Not very many. The vote a few days ago on the suspension of the SNP MP, Margaret Ferrier, she's the MP who travelled on a train after testing positive for COVID. I think there were about 30 Tory rebels there. So it's a hardcore, really, of Tory rebels. And he certainly hasn't got the support he had. I think a lot of mainstream Tory MPs are fed up with him. A lot of those who used to think he was a great campaigner and an asset now see him as a liability. I spent Saturday in Uxbridge in his, what I suppose we should now call his former constituency. And the number of people who said good riddance to him, he's never done anything for Uxbridge. Not all by any means. Some of them were Johnson fans. But I think his support, certainly amongst Conservatives, is on the MPs certainly is on the wane. If you were to ask me to predict Boris Johnson's future, more likely to be the next editor of the Daily Telegraph, especially if it's sold, as it might be, than Prime Minister, I would have thought.
Yeah, there's some very interesting reporting going around this weekend about the Daily Telegraph coming up for sale, just at the same time that Boris Johnson is ennobling former senior editorial staff at the Daily Telegraph.
Indeed,
as
and
well.
you remember Dominic Cummings says that Boris Johnson called the Daily Telegraph my real boss.
The real boss, yeah, fascinating. On that, though, in terms of Boris Johnson's future, there's been a lot of speculation about him doing the so-called chicken run and leaving a sort of bit more of a hairy constituency with a smaller majority in West London and heading towards a safer seat. What do you think?
Let's look at the possibilities. Henley, he was the MP there from 2001 until he became London Mayor. I remember covering the by-election in Henley, the count was in Thame, when John Howell was elected, church organist, Oxfordshire councillor, but he's just retired. Now, John Howell's being very coy with me when I said, well, are you standing down or are you staying? But I was told that John Howell had said to somebody, over my dead body, Boris Johnson coming back to Henley. Remember, Henley is the seat that was previously represented by Michael Heseltine. And I've always said the Tory party's always loved a glamorous blonde, Thatcher, Heseltine, Johnson. That's one possibility, I think very, very unlikely. Second possibility is Nadine Dorris's seat in Mid-Bedfordshire. Her majority, I think, was just under 25,000. Now, I noticed the Sunday Times had a report from Mid-Bedfordshire. Some voters there said they'd quite welcome him there. So he does have his appeal with some certain people. And then I suppose, well, I'm not sure about Selby and Ainsty up in North Yorkshire. I'm not sure Boris Johnson would go down particularly well with the good folk of North Yorkshire, and he's not really their type. Nigel Adams, much more their type. I think he's not returning to Parliament any time soon, I don't think. I think, as you say, I mean, he's as Gito Harry made the point on Sky News, he's enjoying his foreign travel, which is very lucrative. He was in Cairo when he got the email telling him that it was likely that the Privileges Committee were going to throw the book at him. I mean, if you look at it, you could sort of do a sort of fancy diagram of a map of the world of all the places he's been to. And some of the sums of money are enormous, aren't they? And he's had a massive advance on a book as well. And, of course, the advantage of him being outside Parliament now is he doesn't have to declare all those earnings. And some people have said, you know, he needs to make some money. He's got all these children. As Gito Harry was saying, he's about to have another one. I think that's child number 8, isn't it, altogether?
Number 8, I think.
Yeah, it is number 8. So I think probably Boris Johnson is going to enter a period outside Parliament for the time being.
So what do you reckon it means then for Rishi Sunak and the government? Because I was thinking about this, and there's a sort of alternative course of events that if Boris Johnson had decided to stay and fight, what we'd be looking at in probably the days and weeks ahead was the Privileges Committee report coming out, a vote in the Commons on a sanction that would likely determine whether he is suspended and faces a by-election. That would probably be a bloody fight in the Commons with Boris Johnson allies trying to essentially split the party to kind of stick up for their man. I can't see that they would have the numbers to do that. So you would assume that it goes on to a recall petition and a by-election, in which I guess at that point Boris Johnson probably would have stood down anyway. But if he decided to fight on through that, you get a by-election in West London with Boris Johnson as the candidate, which has to be even more of a sort of nightmare scenario more broadly for the government. So actually, in the short term, whilst, yes, this is a sort of bumpy patch and he's got by-elections to fight, is there a way that this could turn out kind of okay for Rishi Sunak if he can use it to almost kind of banish the ghost of Boris Johnson once and for all and start talking about his 5 priorities that he loves to bang on about at any possible opportunity?
That's the optimistic view among Sunak supporters and government loyalists, certainly, yes, that in the long term, It is better for Rishi Sunak. One of the little nuggets in a very long and a very informative piece in the Sunday Times was that Boris Johnson, at the meeting they had, which is a week last Friday, I think the 2nd of June, he'd said to Boris Johnson, if you nod through my honours list, I'll campaign for you in the red wall seats. Now, I thought until prior to this weekend that Boris Johnson probably would help the Tory campaign, particularly in those red wall seats, and be quite a factor. But I think that's looking less likely now, because there does seem to have been a terrible falling out between the current Prime Minister and Mr Johnson.
It's obviously been a pretty busy week for politics across the other side of the Atlantic as well. I wonder, what similarities do you see about how things are playing out for Mr Trump in America and Mr Johnson over here? Because there is a sort of, in the kind of the witch hunt language that Boris Johnson has used, it does seem to have that kind of conspiratorial element to them, that the blob, the establishment are out to get me, they're trying to pull me down, which is exactly the kind of message that Trump is pushing out around this indictment in the States. And is actually finding politically it's sort of working to his favour to an extent. What do you make of those similarities?
Well, the good news for Mr Johnson is he's not facing jail yet, unlike Mr Trump. On Sky News on Saturday, Will Walden, who was another ex-spin doctor for Boris Johnson, and he was also worked at City Hall, used the word Trumpian to describe the way that Mr Johnson had lashed out in that long statement he put out on Friday night. Now, differences between the two, certainly there's the rhetoric is similar, and the lashing out at the establishment, which you talked about. I haven't heard Donald Trump use the term the blob yet, but you never know. The difference, of course, is that Mr Trump wants to be the candidate again next year against Joe Biden, whereas Mr Johnson has just ruled himself out of being a candidate for the time being. That's the big difference between the two. Mr Trump wants to be president again, and of course that could happen next year. If Boris Johnson wants to be Prime Minister, well, that's not going to happen anytime soon.
I thought that Will Walden interview was absolutely fascinating, because he clearly still has quite a lot of affection for his former boss, but at the same time almost felt like he was felt let down by the path that Boris Johnson had gone on. And at one point he said he sort of barely recognised the Boris Johnson of now to the one that he used to work with in City Hall. He sort of said that he seems to see everything through this kind of vindictive prism now, that he sees everything as a plot to get him. Whereas back in the City Hall days, and even the early days before Brexit, he was maybe a bit more thoughtful, a bit more reasoned, and he sort of cited those two columns where he was trying to reason out whether to back Brexit or not. I wonder, John, I mean, you must have covered the whole of Boris Johnson's political career, right from the very start.
And, of course, I knew him as a journalist as well.
OK, so what do you think?
The first time I ever met Boris Johnson, he was a trainee on the Times. I was on the Sunday Times. And Boris was, I think, a graduate trainee. And you'll know, everybody knows, he got fired from the Times for making up a quote. And the first time Boris and I met, Boris said to me, "Oh, Jon Craig, big byline." And of course, I always say, "Well, he's the big byline now." And of course, he went on to have that colourful and controversial career in Brussels, working for the Daily Telegraph, when a lot of his rivals claimed that he made up stories about straight bananas and
powerful vacuum cleaners.
And I think another one was sort of small condoms or big condoms. I can't remember now. For the Italians or something. I can't remember. But the other one was, of course, that they were going to knock down the Berlaymont building because of asbestos. Well, as far as I know, it's still standing. And then, of course, he was a candidate in North Wales in a Labour seat, didn't win that. And then he got Henley when Michael Heseltine retired in 2001. So
what do you think, though, on this question that sort of Will Walden points out? Do you think he's changed as a politician, as a sort of person since those days? Clearly that Euroscepticism was always there. But when he was Mayor of London, he sort of had this almost like kind of cuddly character whereby people in London who would not usually vote for a Tory, a sort of Eton, Oxbridge educated Tory like that, kind of warmed to him. Do you think he's changed? Do you think that the kind of trappings of office and of being in politics for too long has worn him down and made him more vicious and sinister? Or do you think he, at the centre, is still the same person, but just the context has changed?
Well, prime ministers do change in that they are all sunny and cheerful and optimistic and friendly with journalists and everything when they first become Prime Minister, but a few years have been kicked around by Fleet Street and also their political opponents, and you could include people on their own side in that. It makes them more cynical, I think. Just going back to it, Boris Johnson was elected London Mayor in 2008. That came after 2 terms of Ken Livingstone. And I think a lot of Londoners had grown weary of Ken Livingstone by 2008, so he was able to win that. His record, I think, at City Hall, he got some good people around him, some of whom are now in Parliament, like Kit Malthouse, and the late Simon Milton, who was a guy who had been leader of Westminster City Council, sadly died. He had good people around him, and people used to say he was good at delegating. Now, in Parliament, of course, he tried to ride roughshod over all the various rules. Remember the Brexit debates and where he prorogued Parliament and everything? He basically tried to break all the rules. And at the end, I suppose, those sort of things caught up with him. And the whole Partygate thing, he was really... some of those pictures we saw and, the emails we saw about bring your own booze and all that. He was probably badly served by some advisors then, because during COVID, you remember we all obeyed the rules. And if I'd been Prime Minister and said, OK, let's have a drinks party, I'm sure somebody would have said to me, "Oh, Prime Minister, I'm not sure you should do that." The job of Prime Minister does wear you down. There's no doubt about that. You talk to any of the living former Prime Ministers, like Major in particular, and Blair. And Blair had massive majority. But in the end, he was sort of worn down by the whole thing. Blair always says these days, "Oh, I'm not going to criticise a current Prime Minister because I know what it's like." And it is a tough job, there is no doubt about that. And you have to make tough decisions as Prime Minister. To be fair to him, he really did lead from the front on Ukraine as well. So he did some good things, certainly. But in the end, I sat in this studio with Adam Bolton, our former colleague, doing podcasts. And I always used to say, one of these days, Boris Johnson's lies will find him out. And that's what's happened.
Yeah, certainly one of the most consequential Prime Ministers I think we've ever had, even in the relatively short period he was in office. Remarkable to think that just 9 months ago he was in number 10 and now heading out of Parliament full stop. OK, Jon, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Hopefully it's given you a bit of an insight into the sort of things Jon and I have been talking about and looking into in the Sky News Westminster office this weekend. This one was produced by David Chapakapaku. The editor is Paul Stanworth.